Okay, so now we've got a French bind here, and the idea of a French bind is that you don't see any of the stitching on the outside. And of course, because I've done it in black, the stitching, it's very obvious, but you can see, you can imagine if that was in a matching colour and that sort of, that fullness comes over, that the stitching actually is stitched in the ditch and it gets hidden in there. And the nice thing about this is that it's also, like it's finished on the inside nicely and on the outside nicely, and seemingly has no stitching, no top stitching when you've finished it. Okay, so I've got my armhole here again, sewn the shoulder seams and the side seam, and I'm going to start with this one on the outside. And what I'm going to do with this one is that I'm just going to leave a little bit hang over at the beginning here, because I'm going to, once I've stitched the bind around, I'm going to stitch down here so that it'll be finished with a seam on the bind. Actually, because I am going to stitch that seam, I'm just going to start the stitching about 1 centimetre away from where that seam where the seam allowance is, the side seam. And again, we can give it the bias a little bit of a pull to get around these curves, so it sits up. Don't pull on the actual armhole, because that's going to stretch the armhole. The thing with all of these binds too is that you have to do tests of them. Now I've sort of calculated this so that I've got pretty much the right amount of width that I need. So try and calculate it with the seam allowances, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But then, and then do a test run, cut an armhole, cut some bias, and give it a go and see whether it's going to work for you. Because there's nothing worse than cutting out lots of bias and then getting it onto this garment and realizing that it's not wide enough to turn around as much as you want it to. Okay. So now these are the two ends. I'm just going to go 1 centimetre past where the join is there and cut that off. And then on the other side too. Okay, now we're going to stitch this together at 1 centimetre. And because we're going to be folding this over onto itself, it's a good idea here just to trim those seam allowances off a little bit. And because this is going to be folded over and then tucked under, I'm also going to open that seam allowance up and just make sure that the seam allowance on the side seam is going the right way. And so rather than having those overlocked edges going up to the armhole like we've shown you in different ones, this one here is actually going to have a nice finish. So what I'm going to do now is just go into the iron, and I'm going to press the bind towards the armhole. I'll be back in a tick. So I sewed the bias to the outside of the armhole, and now I've pressed the bias towards the armhole, and you can see that under here it's bunched up a little bit, but that's fine. So we're going to do another press now, because the idea with this is that we're actually going to fold this edge under, and we want the folded edge to go just past the original stitch line there. So I need to grab the iron from here. I'm going to press that. Now this can take a little bit of time, but doing this properly here is going to make all the difference when you take it to the machine. I did think I could do this by hand as I was going along, but I really couldn't. So if the iron can help you, let it help you. Oops. There's also a double bind as well, which means that this what I'm turning under would actually be 2 layers thick, and that's a lot easier to manage. It's just that in some fabrics the double one can just get a little bit thick, that's all. Okay, it's fine if it's a little bit uneven on the inside, because it's more important that it's even on the outside. Okay, so that's the outside just there. So I've tucked it under, and now I need to go back and stitch in there to catch the back in place. Okay, so I've got the machine under the foot, and you can see the needle is coming in just right next to that fold there. It's not going on top of the bind, but right next to it. And just make sure as you're going along that you are catching it underneath, and by lifting it up, if you can see the original stitch line, you know that you haven't got it turned under enough. So just keep checking that as you're going along. I think I've got a pretty good run here, which is good. It's just generally more tricky around the underarm curves, but of course it'll all be revealed once we turn it over.
And Mark, you're actually stitching the ditch, you're not stitching on the bind, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. So stitching right next to the folded edge, not on the bind at all. So let's see, turn it over here. So you can see that the bind has been caught all the way around, which is great. And then just imagine if that was actually in a matching colour, you really don't see
A softer fabric too.
a softer fabric. Exactly, it can roll over, and so it just looks like there's a bind there with no stitching at all, which is great. So that's a single French bind.